The president's been shot. You've got to come with me." When Bob heard those words, his expression changed to one of astonishment. Without breaking stride, I grabbed him around the waist and propelled him along until he was running with me. We sprinted past the operating rooms, through the anesthesia conference room, and through the doors into the stairwell. Dr. Ken Salyer, who had sensed the urgency of the moment by our unusual behavior, followed us down to the ER. He told me later that was the only time in his life that he had seen Dr. McClellan or me run anywhere. 2 Secret Service agents burst through the swinging doors into the emergency room and asked for gurneys for the president and Governor Connolly. Hello, welcome back to my channel. And if you're new, then welcome. I'm Jess Connell, and I would love to earn your subscription today. We are getting into a new book today, and it's one that I'm really excited to read with you. I have not pre-read this book. Some books that we do, I pre-read and I edit in advance the selections very carefully. With these, I am reading portions. So I am still selecting portions. Someone asked, is this even legal to do? Yes, it is for educational purposes. And it's under fair use that it shouldn't be so much of the book that it prevents you from wishing to purchase it. And the portions that we will read are selected for our discussion and our education about the JFK assassination, but not in a way that would at all discourage you from purchasing the book. In fact, quite the opposite. Like, there is so much. We just went through this book by Jean Hill. And she was the woman in red across from the grassy knoll right near Jackie when JFK's fatal headshot happened. And so she gave her story as the last dissenting witness. So we went through that, and I say went through it. If I had read this entire book, we probably would have spent 10 to 12 hours minimum with me doing nothing but reading. But we spent basically about 2 or 3 hours discussing that together. And I really enjoyed that book with you guys. I do want to give one little update real quick before we get into today's book. A bunch of people brought up that the one odd recollection that Jean had about the motorcade was that she thought she saw a little dog between JFK and Jackie. She saw something that they looked down at and were laughing. And some people have asserted, many people actually in the comments have asserted, that that was a lamb chops puppet that she had been given at Love Field. I went and tried to find, they even said there's photos of it. I went and looked for a photo of that, and this was the best I could find, and I can't tell that that is a lamb chops puppet. To me, I can't tell what it is. There's her white glove under, and there's the bouquet, and there is something that's like white, but I can't make it out. So if you have a better photo or a link to a better photo or video of that, please put that in the comments. But today we are getting into Charles Crenshaw's book, JFK Conspiracy of Silence. And the interesting thing about Dr. Crenshaw, he is a doctor, you can see there. He was one of the surgeons who was in the room in Trauma Room 1 with JFK on November 22nd, 1963. He also was the physician who was treating Lee Harvey Oswald when he was brought to Trauma Room 2, I believe, just right across the hall, if my memory serves me, from where JFK had been operated on. And so this same man operated on both, and the actual, let's see, the subtitle is Headline Making New Revelations from the Surgeon Who Tried to Save JFK and Oswald. He does have 2 assistant writers here, and he has an introduction, which we're going to read a portion of, by John H. Davis, who is the author of Mafia Kingfish. So we're going to get right into it. I will say there's this little page at the front that says why this book was written. And so we'll read a portion of that. It says, I told my friend, the writer Jens Hansen, that I believed the Warren Commission report to be a fable, a virtual insult to the intelligence of the American people. He asked me if I had ever considered letting someone help me write a book on the subject. I explained to him that we doctors who had worked on President Kennedy, whether out of respect or out of fear, had agreed not to publish what we had seen, heard, and felt. Jens looked at me and said, I know you've heard this a million times, and I don't want to sound like I'm preaching, But the American people have a right to know exactly what went on in Trauma Room 1 and exactly what you saw. Moreover, they have the right to know that their government was changed, that the course of history was dramatically altered in 1963 through a conspiracy to assassinate the President of the United States. Wow, that's a big promise to make on page 1 of your book. So I'm looking forward to getting into this with you guys. There is plenty of video, I will let you know, of Charles Crenshaw. Some of these people, I know Jean Hill, there are audio footage. Charles Crenshaw made these assertions in the 90s for the first time, and these were recorded. I believe there's video interviews and other things that you can find with him. So if you want to do your own digging, you can go get after it. The foreword, written by John H. Davis. It says, the overwhelming majority of books on the JFK assassination have been written by people who had no firsthand personal experience with the crime. Dr. Charles Crenshaw is one of the very few writers on the assassination who was directly involved in the tragic events of November 22nd through the 24th, 1963, in Dallas. It was his fate as a 30-year-old surgeon. So we're going to have that in our minds this whole book, that at the time of these events, he was a 30-year-old surgeon, to assist in trying to save the lives of the mortally wounded president and his accused assassin in Dallas's Parkland Hospital. Dr. Crenshaw's book, then, is unique. It is the Kennedy assassination seen from one who has lived it on the front lines, from one who was there twice, covered with blood and gore, trying desperately to rescue 2 men from death. As such, it grants us a fresh new vision of what has come to be known as the crime of the century. Other writers have postulated that the president was struck by at least 1, perhaps 2 bullets fired from the front, whereas the Warren Commission asserted Kennedy was struck twice from behind. Dr. Crenshaw, as one of the surgeons treating the president's wounds, saw with his own eyes that Kennedy was struck twice from the front, once in the neck and once in the right side of his head. This, of course, meant that Oswald had not acted alone. This first-hand observation is enough to make Dr. Crenshaw's book significant, but it by no means exhausts the revelations in JFK, Conspiracy of Silence. As Dr. Crenshaw was battling to save the lives of John F. Kennedy and Lee Harvey Oswald, some profoundly disturbing things happened in the trauma rooms in which he was working. While he was treating President Kennedy's wounds in Trauma Room 1, he observed a Secret Service agent roaming around the room, brandishing a pistol cocked and ready to fire while shouting and muttering to himself. 2 days later, another armed individual was mysteriously present in the operating room while Dr. Crenshaw and his colleagues struggled to save Oswald from death. But these were relatively insignificant occurrences compared to the telephone call Dr. Crenshaw received while he was attending to Oswald's wounds. In the middle of trying to save the accused assassin's life, Dr. Crenshaw was called to the phone in the hospital supervisor's office. He was astonished to find his caller was the newly sworn-in President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson brusquely told Crenshaw he wanted a deathbed confession from Oswald and that there was a man in the room who would receive it. The doctor told the president he would do what he could. When he returned to his patient, he knew immediately he could not save Oswald, and there would be no deathbed confession. The mysterious man with the pistol was hovering nearby, waiting to take the confession. Dr. Crenshaw told him that Oswald was near death and there would be no confession. The mystery man then quickly disappeared. What are we to make of this strange episode? Was Lyndon Johnson a plotter in the conspiracy to kill President Kennedy? Was Johnson trying to get a confession of sole guilt from Oswald that would strengthen the already proclaimed official assertion that he was a lone nut assassin? Was Johnson already trying to get himself off the hook? These thoughts ran through Dr. Crenshaw's mind after Oswald was officially declared dead and the young surgeon left the operating room. It's now widely believed that Johnson's good friend FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was most definitely an accessory after the fact in the assassination of President Kennedy. There is indisputable proof that Hoover withheld vital evidence from the Warren Commission that would have contradicted his hasty conclusion that Oswald had acted alone. Hoover and Johnson were very close. Both had felt threatened by President Kennedy. Johnson was fearful that Kennedy was going to drop him from his ticket as the running mate in 1964. Kennedy's assassination was the solution to both men's worst fears. On May 8th, 1964, a firmly ensconced President Johnson signed an executive order waiving Hoover's mandatory retirement at age 65 and requested that the veteran bureaucrat continue as director of the FBI. Interesting. Dr. Crenshaw, now 59, so he was 59 at the time of publishing, so he waited almost 30 years. Dr. Crenshaw, now 59, but still chairman of the Department of Surgery at John Peter Smith, the Southwestern Medical School affiliated hospital in Fort Worth, Texas, is a man of impeccable reputation. Furthermore, his co-author Gary Shaw is a Kennedy assassination researcher and writer who has been investigating the case for 27 years and has acquired a reputation for scrupulous research and measured judgment. There are other doctors that it mentions, but it asks, why didn't Dr. Crenshaw reveal what went on in Trauma Room 1 and the Oswald operating room? Why did he keep silent all these years? And he answers it. He says, if Dr. Crenshaw had dropped his bombshells on the Warren Commission in 1964, it might have resulted in his dismissal from hospital staff and his becoming a pariah in the medical profession. In other words, it could have ruined his medical career. Thus, did Dr. Crenshaw and the other physicians treating the wounds of John F. Kennedy and Lee Harvey Oswald enter into what Dr. Crenshaw calls a conspiracy of silence to hide their knowledge of the circumstances surrounding the deaths of the president and Oswald. Now that conspiracy of silence has finally been broken by Dr. Crenshaw, and we should be grateful to him for what he has done. Okay, so many of you in the last book we're like, well, especially people who don't believe Jean Hill, we're like, she changed her story, we can't believe her, etc. And I think the fact that he is owning this from the beginning is instructive for us. It is helpful to consider. He's saying, look, I was a 30-year-old surgeon, which at 30, I don't know the exact timeline of medical training, but I will say it seems like you're kind of in training until you're 25. Does that seem right? 26. And then to be a surgeon. So at 30, he had multiple years probably under his belt, and he was definitely serving under a more senior physician. But I think I can see that fear. I like that he went ahead and shared that at the beginning through this forward. And I think it's good for us to consider what would we have done? We can all say, oh, I would have, it's like people who say, I would have been the person who would have hidden Jews in my house, right? Or I would have been the person who stood up and fought in this instance. I wouldn't have put up with this. I would have spoken out. I would be a whistleblower. And it's like, well, it's easy to say that, but it is harder to put your, 6 to 8 years of training at risk to speak out on something that would have seemed like a national security issue, something where you've perhaps potentially spoken with the president. So I'm excited to read his story. Let's dig into it. It says, Introduction. My name is Charles A. Crenshaw. I have been a surgeon for 30 years. Throughout my career, I have watched thousands of gurneys slam through swinging doors of emergency rooms, carrying the old and the young, the rich and the poor, the broken and the dying. Without exception, every time I have walked into an emergency room, I have encountered a victim of some unexpected calamity, the course of his life abruptly, sometimes permanently interrupted. Terror, fear, remorse, shock, anger, and disbelief are but a few of the emotions that characterize trauma patients and their families. Helping these people is my business. So he talks about trauma for a little bit. Then he goes on, trauma is not respectful of age, race, sex, occupation, or status. Over the years, the faces of the many victims I've treated have blended into an indistinct, obscured visage of pain, fear, and death. After so many cases, all my trauma patients seem as one, except for two: John Fitzgerald Kennedy and Lee Harvey Oswald. The assassination of President Kennedy, the wounding of Governor Connolly, and the murder of Lee Harvey Oswald were, in medical terms, classic cases of devastating trauma, specifically hemorrhagic shock caused by profuse bleeding. One moment, the president and governor were riding in a motorcade through downtown Dallas on a beautiful sunny day, waving happily to the crowd. Only minutes later, they were at Parkland Hospital, mortally wounded, fighting for their lives. It was sudden, it was unexpected, and it was life-altering. As for Oswald, he believed that he was securely in the custody of Dallas Police Department. Then, in a fraction of a second, he felt a sharp pain in his abdomen, and the American people had witnessed their first ever murder live on their television sets. Enormous damage was done to these men by the bullets that ripped through their bodies. The entire right hemisphere of President Kennedy's brain was obliterated. Almost every organ in Oswald's abdomen was ravaged. Wow. And Governor Connolly almost died from the missile that traversed his chest, arm, and leg. Trauma can attack psychologically as well as physically, and he goes on to talk about that. Compared with other events and incidents in my life, treating the President of the United States as he lay fatally wounded and then operating on the man who allegedly shot him is like matching a magnificent ocean against an insignificant pond. Never in my wildest imagination did I consider that as a resident surgeon at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas, on that fateful November day in 1963, I would experience the most poignant moments of my entire life. Ironically, feverishly struggling to save the dim spark of life remaining in President Kennedy's dying body was only the beginning of a harrowing weekend that ultimately introduced me to a level of discretion we seldom discover, one that I have had to practice to protect my medical career and possibly my life. Southwestern Medical School, Parkland Hospital, and the U.S. government have never been overly subtle about their desire for us doctors to keep quiet and not divulge what we heard, saw, and felt that November weekend in 1963. I'm going to pause, but I do want to say that something else that came up in our discussions of Jean Hill's book is the view of authority at that time was quite different from what it is now. Now we have these ideas of, speak up, use your voice. Like even we honor whistleblowers, and we recognize that someone who puts their career at risk to tell an important truth might be serving all of us. And that can be abused as well. But we do have a different view of authority. We don't see it as it's always wrong to speak up about somebody. We've gone through Me Too. We have a lot of different moments where we have all come to recognize, look, you can't always trust the priests. You can't always trust the teachers and principals. You can't always trust policemen or government officials to 100% only do what is appropriate and just and proper. And so, I think we have to listen to these accounts with the comprehension that what he's saying is probably true. His medical career probably could have been damaged or completely lost if he had spoken up. Now, should he have still spoken up? That's a question for all of us to ponder in our own minds. Would we have spoken up? I don't know. But he did not until now. So he's telling us why he did. He says that from the time President Kennedy was wheeled into the emergency room until the recent filming in Dallas of Oliver Stone's movie, JFK, the doctors who witnessed President Kennedy's death have always felt the necessity to continue what has evolved over the years as a conspiracy of silence. Just recently, a gag order was issued from Southwestern Medical School warning those doctors still on staff there to not confer with Oliver Stone about President Kennedy's condition when he was brought into Parkland, despite the fact that President Kennedy was neurologically dead when he was taken from his limousine. Both Parkland Hospital and Southwestern Medical School, partners in academic medicine, will always be defensive about losing the most important patient they ever had. So we read that in Paul Landis's book. He talked about the body of the president. Remember, he kept referring to the president's body before they ever got it out of the car. And so his assertion was that the president was already clearly dead at the time. And so he's confirming that thing. Throughout the years, there have been 1,000 instances that I have wanted to shout to the world that the wounds to Kennedy's head and throat that I examined were caused by bullets that struck him from the front, not the back, as the public has been led to believe. Instinctively, I have reached for the telephone many times to call a television station to set the story straight when I heard someone confidently claim that Oswald was the lone gunman from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, only to restrain myself. Until now. The hundreds of similar cases involving gunshots that I have seen and treated since 1963 have further convinced me that my conclusions about President Kennedy's wounds were correct. I know trauma, especially to the head. To this day, I do not understand why the Warren Commission did not interview every doctor in President Kennedy's room. The men on that commission heard exactly what they wanted to hear, or what they were instructed to hear, and then reported what they wanted to report or what they were instructed to report. Had I been allowed to testify, I would have told them that there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that the bullet that killed President Kennedy was shot from the grassy knoll area. I would have also informed the Warren Commission about the call I received from Lyndon Johnson while we were operating on Lee Harvey Oswald. President Johnson told me that a man in the operating room would get a deathbed confession from Oswald. The incident confounded logic. Why the President of the United States would get personally involved in the investigation of the assassination, or why he would take the inquest out of the hands of the Texas authorities, was perplexing. He says that for more than a year, his friend's encouragement that he should write the book echoed in his mind. Since 1963, people had encouraged me to write about my knowledge of JFK's death, but never before had I seriously considered doing so. He writes eloquently about the memories and the nightmares that he would have day after day that would assault him, the images of the president and his alleged assassin. He talks about the doctors. He talks about the memories of interacting with Jackie. And then he says that finally, in November of 1990, he sat down at his desk and decided to tell his story. He realized that the compulsion to chronicle his account of that fateful weekend at Parkland Hospital had begun to grow. I knew I had to speak out, if for no other reason because the democratic process created by the greatest constitutional document ever written was being callously and maliciously circumvented by a handful of cowards, and my silence has protected them. Efforts to suppress and distort the truth about the assassination on the part of government officials and agents, as well as certain representatives of the media, have been well documented in previous works on this subject. That these efforts included threats, intimidation, falsification, and destruction of evidence, and even death, have played no small part in my silence over the past 28 years. I am 59 years old. My medical career is over, and I no longer fear the men in suits nor the criticism of my peers. So that's how he felt. He meets the other man, Gary Shaw, who was going to help him. And he says the cover-up of the truth of that nightmare in Dallas has insulted all thinking Americans by revealing details of the events that occurred and the medical facts of the patients treated during those 3 days at Parkland Hospital in 1963. We hope to provide a new perspective on the assassination of President Kennedy and the tremendous yet frightening efforts to cover it up. Here is my account of those 3 incredible days at Parkland. So that is his telling of what he is doing in this book. We are going to move into part 1, the beginnings. He tells about his growing up years. He, of course, never imagined that he would be in such an important moment. He chose the University of Texas branch of that medical school in Dallas because not only was Southwestern the closest medical school, it was the most affordable. Tuition was only $150 a semester, excluding books. There wasn't any ivy growing on the walls, but it was a damn good school just the same. It was there that Dr. Tom Shires, professor and chairman of the surgical department at Parkland, who we referred to as the Little Caesar of surgery, inspired me to become a surgeon. Dr. Shires had told me that a surgeon is an internist who can cut. So he talks about his medical training. He says, I was a confident doctor, as we all were, even arrogant, I suppose. Our lofty opinions of our abilities as surgeons were partly attributable to the way in which we had learned surgical procedures. The saying went, see one, do one, teach one. There was a lot of competition among us, but we respected one another as physicians and surgeons, and we worked well together as a team. We believed we could provide the best medical care in the country. But the hospital was nervous about the image of residents playing such a supreme role in its services, although it was true. As a result, certain med school officials deliberately masked the major role that I and other resident surgeons played in the medical aspects of the Kennedy assassination, and the Warren Commission failed to obtain from us what would have been important testimony. I had experience with head wounds from high-powered rifles, and I definitely had an opinion about the trauma to Kennedy's skull, which was in conflict with the doctors who performed the autopsy. I can't speak for my fellow physicians who were in Trauma Room 1, but I wasn't about to rock the boat by broadcasting my thoughts on the president's death, which could have threatened my future in academic medicine, and as it now seems, possibly even my life. Many people still hold to the misconception that President Kennedy was delivered to a group of ragtag country doctors whose medical expertise was limited to suturing cuts and treating sore throats. We didn't appreciate doctors from Eastern medical establishment inferring that the president didn't get superlative health care. The truth was to the contrary, as evidenced by the impressive careers of the staff and resident surgeons who were at Parkland Hospital's emergency room that day in 1963. So he does give us a little overview of these doctors, and I am going to go ahead and read them, not only because some of these names are the ones that we will see many times over as we watch, Kennedy documentaries. We see many of these names, but also because I do think it's important for us to intake the medical pedigrees of these men. So let's hear about it. Dr. Tom Shires, who until recently was chief of surgery and dean of Cornell University Medical School in New York, is now chief of surgery at Texas Tech Medical School in Lubbock, Texas. He went on to Cornell, very prestigious, and then Texas Tech Medical School, which is also a highly rated medical program here in Texas. Dr. Malcolm Perry, who until recently was professor of surgery and chief of vascular services at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, is now professor and chief of vascular surgery at Texas Tech University Medical School in Lubbock. So interesting, he ended up there as well. Dr. James Red Duke, the surgeon who operated on Governor Connolly, is professor of surgery and director of emergency services at the UT Medical School in Houston. University of Texas is highly rated. Dr. Charles Baxter and Dr. Robert McClellan are professors of surgery at Southwestern Medical School. So interestingly, they stayed. Charles Baxter and Robert McClellan. McClellan was in some documentaries after this point, I believe, but I don't know if he had been until this point done any interviews. But they stayed there at Southwestern. Dr. Charles Carrico is chairman of the Department of Surgery at Parkland Hospital and Southwestern Medical School, so he stayed as well. Dr. Ronald Jones is chief of general surgery at Baylor Medical Center. Very good. And I am now clinical professor of surgery at Southwestern Medical School and director and chairman of the Department of Surgery at John Peter Smith Hospital in Fort Worth, Texas. If I had been wheeled into an emergency room mortally wounded, I would have felt pretty confident knowing that a surgical team like this one was taking care of me. I've often considered what would have happened if President Kennedy's motorcade had been traveling east when he was shot, because they would have gone to Baylor Hospital. Back then, Baylor wasn't a teaching facility, and its staff wasn't prepared for trauma. There would have been perhaps one resident surgeon there. Connolly, who was closer to death than anyone actually realized, may very well have died. Today, Baylor is a fine trauma hospital with excellent surgeons. So that's an interesting thought. I had never thought of that, but of course, as a physician, he would have. Baylor is a place where, my family has gone to Baylor Hospital off and on my whole life. My mom has worked for Baylor. It's a local medical facility that's excellent, actually. But it's interesting that they didn't have a teaching hospital there at that time, and Southwestern did at Parkland. During my first year of residency, I conducted research in a fellowship under Dr. Shires' supervision, in which we made medical history by discovering that death from hemorrhagic shock, which is blood loss, can be due primarily to the body's adjunctive depletion of internal salt water into the cells. So he talks about other physicians there that won the Nobel Prize for their research into cholesterol metabolism. I consider Southwestern now among the top 5 medical schools in the country, and I believe Parkland Hospital to be one of the finest trauma facilities in the world. So he is telling us that actually the medical heritage of this place and of these people was excellent, particularly for the time. Now, in 1963, he gives us a little familiarity with Parkland itself. And this is good to know. I don't believe I've ever heard this information. So it says it was a 550-bed hospital located between Harry Hines Boulevard and Stemmons Expressway, 5 miles north of downtown Dallas. It served an area population of 1 million people. Out of 300 residents and interns, there were 25 general surgical residents. Today, Parkland is a 760-bed hospital with 850 residents and interns. Since its inception, Parkland has been a MASH unit for Dallas County's war zone, primarily treating the indigent who have no health insurance and who lack the money to purchase health care from private hospitals. As such, many of the injured brought to Parkland's emergency room are drunk, belligerent, and sometimes violent. On an average day, 380 emergencies are treated. For years, we doctors there referred to the trauma team as those who treated the knife and gun club. Very fascinating. So, yes, that area of Dallas is still as he describes. It is a lot of poor individuals. And like he said, especially at that time, they lacked insurance. Medical insurance was something for the wealthy. And so he was dealing with violent and belligerent people who had experienced traumatic actions. They said the knife and gun club. This would be the place to understand trauma. When JFK came to Dallas, healthcare was very different from what it is today, especially in the treatment of trauma-related injuries. Ambulances were hearses, equipped with a single tank of oxygen, and there were no emergency technicians. Blood from African Americans was not allowed to be transfused into whites, and vice versa. Other hospitals in Dallas didn't want to treat trauma cases because they were a money-losing proposition. A hospital's entire annual budget for such care could be, and many times was, spent on a few patients. And there were no programs like Medicare or Medicaid. Mostly, we were treating the poor and underprivileged. Given the choice, a person of any means would never have chosen to go to Parkland because of its reputation. That is, unless he was in need of trauma care, in which Parkland Hospital substantially improved his chances for survival. Otherwise, the selection would have been a private hospital. The Dallas police were our best friends because they protected us when we had to treat someone who was spitting, hitting, biting, or kicking. We could handle the abusive language, but not the physical attacks. So he talks about that, a man who pulled a pistol on him, and he says it was the wild, wild west of the medical world. So he's giving us a great picture of what Parkland was like. It says, working as a second-year resident there, I was almost always exhausted, irritable, and often ill. I was so used to this condition that at one point, it wasn't until my eyeballs turned yellow that I realized I had hepatitis. We called residency the black hole because the doctors in it were struggling to escape, and the young physicians desiring to become surgeons were working to get in. In addition to working the emergency room every other night, we served on elective surgery teams, A, B, and C, where we worked every third night. We always rotated every other day on trauma surgical teams 1 and 2. I worked 36 out of every 48 hours. Ooh. 7 days a week in an atmosphere of bedlam, all for a mere $100 a month, leaving little time for my wife and child. He says the conditions of an emergency room are paradoxical. He says we were skilled surgeons fighting to preserve life, yet the conditions under which we saw it made us increasingly irreverent toward it. I've heard that actually some of the most what would it be called? Like black humor, morose humor is in people who deal with trauma like this, or like morticians, that people who have to encounter death have to deal with it and end up developing kind of a thick skin toward it. I imagine you'd have to on some level. I've always considered myself a conservative Democrat. I remember the political atmosphere on the eve of November 22nd, 1963. In 1960, Nixon won Dallas County. During the heat of that election, the Republican congressman from Dallas spat on Lyndon Johnson and his wife as they walked from the Baker Hotel to the Adolphus. 1 month before President Kennedy came to Dallas in 1963, a housewife who was part of an extreme right-wing group hit UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson in the head with an anti-UN sign. You know, I had heard that, but that is interesting that it's a housewife, not an angry, man with a pistol or young man, but a housewife is that angry. As he fled through the protesting mob, someone spat upon him. Even after he was in his automobile, the crowd rocked the car in an attempt to overturn it. If John Kennedy came to Dallas today, the city would warmly embrace him as their president. But in those days, the influence of extreme political factions made it appear that Dallas hated President Kennedy. Not so much the man himself, but the person it perceived him to be. It wasn't that Texans wanted him dead. They just didn't want him as their president. We knew our European history pretty well, and like the founding fathers, we didn't want a king. He came across as royalty with money, his lifestyle, his family, and his charisma. As I remember, the only politician in Texas who liked him was Ralph Yarborough. It's interesting, I just saw a photo of Ralph Yarborough wiping his face. Those of you who are longtime viewers, you know this, but I have a problem, and it is this. I am a sucker for old magazines, and I found some that we need to go through together. I mean, we just are going to need to go through, but one of them had a photo of Ralph Yarborough wiping his face, like crying at Parkland. So it's interesting that he mentions that, because I saw that very thing, and it struck me. I hadn't read this yet, obviously, but it just struck me that a man that well seasoned in government would just be willing to lose himself in a public place like that. It just showed his grief and shock. Bobby and Jacqueline had warned the president not to travel to Dallas, but he came down here anyway to soothe the ruffled feathers of the state Democratic Party. Lyndon Johnson, John Connolly, and Ralph Yarborough were all at one another's throats over the growing movement to dump Johnson in 1964 as the vice president. Then he asks, where were you on November 22nd, 1963? I would love to hear that. I know many of you lived through these days. You remember where you were when you heard that JFK had been assassinated, and many of you have said that you actually watched as Lee Harvey Oswald got murdered on live television. So I would love to hear from you in the comments where you were. I wasn't born until 1979, so these things for me are all history that I've grown up knowing rather than a traumatic event that I lived through. I will tell you though, even this last weekend as I was browsing magazines, many times I just was moved to tears as I contemplated. I mean, one of the ones that moved me to tears was Coretta Scott King, and a photo of she and Ethel holding hands after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And I just sat there and thought, oh my goodness, like the quickness of those years was crazy. So history definitely moves me emotionally, but I didn't live through this one. I would love to hear where you were. How old were you? Did you watch Lee Harvey Oswald get murdered? He says, almost 3 decades ago, early on the morning of that historic day, I was in surgery, beginning yet another round in the war of medicine against mayhem. But this tour of duty would be different. It would inexorably thrust me directly into the path of a spellbinding drama. It was an adventure of which most people can only dream. It was a life-changing experience. When I walked into Trauma Room 1, I entered the halls of history. Okay, something interesting that he does is he actually walks through hour by hour what was happening. And he tells his things that he was doing, like getting ready not saying hello to his son, Chad, because his son was 3 and it's 4 a.m. So he's getting out of his apartment. But also he arrives at the hospital. He orders lab tests for some things. He's doing all the medical things like normal. He's looking in on critical patients, just checking in on things. And he lets us know something that I didn't realize, that Dr. Shires was actually in Galveston that day. So he was not the attending physician. Dr. Charles Baxter, a legend in his own time, was 4 years my senior and had greatly influenced my desire to become a surgeon. So he is the one who is the supervising physician that day. So they scrub up, but still he continues the march forward. And so it's interesting. I would just say again, I am not reading this entire book. If you are interested, I think you would enjoy, if you're at all interested in the JFK assassination, it's very fascinating. He says like, Lee Harvey Oswald was getting into the car, to go, or Jackie and Jack were at the hotel in Fort Worth, or that kind of thing. So very fascinating, hour by hour account of what he was doing. Again, I am not going to go through it, but you will want to go through. It is very fascinating because they have actually collated a lot of the research for us. And so I believe I'm actually going to go back and reread those portions of this book because it's fascinating. He talks about things going on in the Texas School Book Depository. He talks about things going on the ground. So again, if you're interested, you'd want to grab this book. I got my copy off of eBay, just so you know. So I think there's probably some on Amazon, but I would make no money off of that. I'm just letting you guys know, like, I think if you're interested in this, you would like this book. I will link to an option on Amazon in the show notes, but you can get your copy anywhere. 12:37 p.m., he tells us, is when Parkland Hospital, Dallas, gets the call. The telephone rings at Parkland's emergency room nurses station. The Dallas Police Department advises Doris Nelson, head nurse in emergency, that President Kennedy has been shot and is en route to the hospital. Nelson immediately orders personnel to prepare Trauma Room 1 for the president's arrival. So that's interesting. That's something I've always wondered about, is did they know in advance? I mean, even just a moment ago, he said that the phone lines were all jammed almost immediately. And so it's interesting that even at that time, it makes you wonder, like, did somebody use a walkie-talkie? Did the police confer with Secret Service? I'm sure there's researchers who have done that, but it's interesting that in a time without cell phones, they still, in that matter of a few minutes, because it's only a few minutes drive up the highway, that they were able to alert the ER that he was coming. 12:38. I had just completed writing instructions on the first chart when I heard the unbelievable over the public address system. Paging Dr. Tom Shires, paging Dr. Tom Shires, the voice urgently uttered. I couldn't have been more shocked. I simply couldn't believe I had heard it. 2 things never happened at Parkland. Facelift surgery. So he's saying they didn't do plastic surgery back then. And the chief of surgery being paged over the intercom. If someone needed Dr. Shires, a messenger was sent. Hearing Dr. Shires' name echoing from the ceiling speaker shared me. I was concerned that one of the patients Dr. Shires had entrusted to me in his absence was experiencing upper gastrointestinal hemorrhaging. I immediately picked up the telephone and dialed 0 to answer the page. Mert, this is Dr. Crenshaw. Dr. Shires is out of town. What do you need? Dr. Crenshaw, the president has been shot. After a moment of intense silence, I replied, if you're kidding me, I'll kill you. This is no joke, Dr. Crenshaw. Mert was a buxom woman in her 50s who liked to play practical jokes, but the panic in her voice told me she was serious. A bone-chilling sensation rushed through my body as I thought of going down to emergency and treating the President of the United States. At that instant, any lingering question of why I had become a surgeon was answered definitively, once and for all. I slammed down the phone, jumped from my chair, and bolted through the double doors into the surgical area toward the stairwell leading to the emergency room 2 floors below us. Dr. Robert McClelland was standing in the hall, perusing the surgical scheduling board located directly across from the hall from the doctor's lounge. When he looked up and saw me approaching in a full gallop, a perplexed expression covered his face. Bob, I exclaimed as I came charging up to where he was standing, the president's been shot. You've got to come with me. When Bob heard those words, his expression changed to one of astonishment. Without breaking stride, I grabbed him around the waist and propelled him along until he was running with me. We sprinted past the operating rooms, through the anesthesia conference room, and through the doors into the stairwell. Dr. Kinsalyer, who had sensed the urgency of the moment by our unusual behavior, followed us down to the ER. He told me later that was the only time in his life that he had seen Dr. McClellan or me run anywhere. 2 Secret Service agents burst through the swinging doors into the emergency room and asked for gurneys for the president and Governor Connolly. Dr. Bill Midget, a second-year OB-GYN resident who had delivered Marina Oswald's baby on October 20th, 1963, only about a month earlier, was the first doctor to encounter the president outside the emergency room. Oof, there's a lot packed into that sentence, isn't there? A doctor that delivered Marina Oswald's baby about a month before was the first doctor to encounter the president outside the emergency room. Wow. Several moments later, that doctor and several nurses rolled the president into Trauma Room 1 with Jackie walking at his side. The president was logged into the register as patient number 24740 at 12:38 p.m. Governor Connolly was logged in as patient number 24743, an indication that other patients were being admitted and treated in the ER during the time when the president was being wheeled in. As I leaped down the stairs, Dr. McClellan at my side, I had a terrible fear that I would be the only resident doctor in the room. I didn't know it, but Bob had a similar thought, fearing that he would be the only staff doctor there. With labored breath, Dr. McClellan asked me what had happened. I remembered hearing the coins jingling in his pocket with each step. I don't know. I took Shire's page and Mert told me that Kennedy had been shot. Once we reached the bottom of the stairwell, we opened the door and rushed into the emergency room. There is always commotion around trauma, but what I saw was sheer bedlam. As we flew by the nurse's station, I yelled, "Which room?" A nurse with tears streaming down her face raised one finger. Whew. It's interesting to encounter this, and I think it's going to be interesting to hear if his emotion gets in the way at all through all of this, because there are certain things where, of course, like we just talked about, you would have to have a hardened exterior in order to encounter hard things day after day after day and not be just completely crumbling every 8 minutes, you know. But still, even with that, things like this would break through that hard crust of like, wait, this is the president. I looked to my left and I saw a man in a suit running. To my amazement, another man in a suit jumped in his path and smashed a Thompson submachine gun across his chest and face. The first man's eyes immediately turned glassy and he fell against a gray wall and slithered to the floor unconscious. When I heard that gun slam against his face, I just knew that the man's jaw was broken. In a normal situation, that would take all of your, focus. But here he is, and he says, normally I would have rushed over and treated the poor guy, but the President of the United States was waiting for me, and his condition was worse than broken bones. I was later to learn that the man with the gun was a Secret Service agent, and the one who had been hit was an FBI agent. It was a GD madhouse in the emergency room. People running, yelling. Everyone suspected everyone else. Complete and utter paranoia. That's the only way to describe it. As I turned to continue toward Trauma Room 1, there was Lyndon Johnson being ushered into one of the minor medicine cubicles, which were located past the nurse's station and partitioned by sliding curtains. His face was ashen, and he was holding his chest. Only recently he had had a coronary, and I was afraid he was having another heart attack. Behind the vice president was Ralph Yarborough, crying. Moments later, Bob and I entered Trauma Room 1. The first person I came face to face with was Jacqueline Kennedy, who was just standing inside the door in pensive quietness, clutching her purse, her pillbox hat slightly askew. She turned and gazed at me, then refocused her attention on her husband. The look on her face forever marked my memory. Anger, disbelief, despair, and resignation were all present in her expression. I whispered, my God, it's true." In 1963, President Kennedy and Jacqueline received the same kind of attention that Prince Charles and Lady Di do today. That's a sad reference, isn't it? He didn't know, of course, that that would also have its own sad, traumatic end. I had read stories in newspapers and magazines that claimed the First Lady and President no longer cared for one another, that the perpetuation of their marriage was a necessity because of the presidency. Human tragedy strips away facade, exposing the person's core of true feelings and emotions in all the sentiments I have seen displayed and heard in my 30 years of practice by people grieving and hurting over trauma victims. I never saw or sensed more intense and genuine love than Jacqueline showed at that moment toward her dying husband. Drying blood caked the right side of Jacqueline's dress and her leg. Her once white gloves were stained almost complete crimson. If she hadn't been standing, I would have thought she had been shot too. As Dr. McClellan and I approached, Dr. Malcolm Perry, the assistant professor of surgery, blurted that he and Dr. Jim Carrico, the physician who had first entered the room, had already inserted an endotracheal tube, breathing tube, down the president's throat. In astonishment, I beheld the President of the United States lying before me. Blood was caked on his steel gray suit, and his shirt was the same crimson color. Even in that condition, his charisma filled the room. He was a larger man than I had imagined him. In fact, he filled the entire gurney. For someone who had been sickly most of his life, the President looked strong and substantial, just what you expect in a man who had achieved that degree of success. I was standing at about the President's waist, making a quick inspection of his general appearance. His face was unmarked and exquisite. His eyes were open and divergent. They were still and devoid of life. I immediately became pessimistic. Then I noticed that the entire right hemisphere of his brain was missing, beginning at his hairline and extending all the way behind his right ear. Pieces of skull that hadn't been blown away were hanging by blood-matted hair. Based upon my experience with trauma to the head from gunshots, I knew that only a high-velocity bullet from a rifle could dissect a cranium that way. Part of his brain, the cerebellum, was dangling from the back of his head by a single strand of tissue, looking like a piece of dark gray, blood-soaked sponge that would easily fit in the palm of a hand. Blood was still seeping from the wound onto the gurney, dripping into the kick bucket on the floor. Seeing that, I became even more pessimistic. I also identified a small opening about the diameter of a pencil at the midline of his throat to be an entry bullet hole. There was no doubt in my mind about that wound. I had seen dozens of them in the emergency room. At that point, I knew he had been shot at least twice. Other doctors were rushing in to help. Doctors Baxter and Paul Peters, assistant professor of urology, had come from the medical school. Dr. Salyer had followed us from the second floor. Instinctively, I took the right leg. Dr. Salyer was stationed at my side to assist me. Everyone, physicians and nurses alike, knew what to do because we had been through this procedure hundreds, if not thousands of times. But I believed, as I think every doctor in Trauma Room 1 thought, that the President was dead from the very beginning. But he was the President of the United States, and we had to do something. After all, we were surgeons. Doctors McClellan and Ron Jones were stationed at the left arm and chest. Doctors Baxter and Peters took the right side of his torso. With a distressed look on his face, Dr. Baxter glanced at me and shook his head in amazement. There was no doubt in my mind that he was referring to his earlier comment about meeting the President at the back of the hospital. Okay, so I actually went back to figure out what that's referencing. There's a whole section that I skipped because it's like the play-by-play, and a lot of it was just like the medical goings-on of that morning. But I asked Dr. Baxter, are you going to take off early and go downtown to watch Kennedy's parade? And Dr. Baxter shook his head and said that the only way he would see that SOB would be if he came to the back door of the hospital. The back of Parkland was the ER, and Dr. Baxter was the staff surgeon in charge of the ER. His reference to the president wasn't as disrespectful as it might seem, considering that Baxter called him an SOB. It was the personal pronoun he used for man and objects alike. So that's what that's referencing. Wow. Turning to my right, I noticed that Jacqueline was still standing in the room. I wasn't sure if there was anything we could do to save her husband, but I didn't want her to witness what we were about to do to him. "Mrs. Kennedy, I think you should step outside," Dr. Baxter said. Without taking her eyes off the president, she turned and walked from the room, watching him until she disappeared through the door. I was relieved. As I turned back to the president, I spotted another problem. Clint Hill, the Secret Service agent who had pushed Jackie back into the car, was rambling around the room in a wild-eyed, disoriented fashion, waving a cocked and ready-to-fire .38 caliber pistol. There we were, getting ready to work on a man who had just lost half his head from a bullet, and we had a crazed man running around with a loaded gun. I didn't know what he was going to do. Hill had failed to do his job, which was to protect the President of the United States. My concern at that moment was that he would prevent us from doing our jobs, which was to give the president whatever chance we could. "Baxter," I said, as nurses rushed to wheel into place the portable tables that contained cut-down and chest tube trays. "What are we going to do about him?" Before Dr. Baxter could say anything, Nurse Doris Nelson, supervisor of the emergency room, a heavy-set, granite-faced, no-nonsense woman, turned to Hill and snapped, "Whoever shot the president is not in this room." Hill didn't respond. "Look," she persisted. "He's okay. He's okay. He's okay," she repeated as she pointed to each doctor. "Now put away the gun so we can get to work." Hill simply vanished. I don't remember seeing him again. Years later, I was informed that he had to be institutionalized because of a nervous breakdown. Hill's behavior in Trauma Room 1 told me that he had already flipped out. Reports were that as the president's limousine sped away from downtown Dallas, he was ferociously beating his fist against the trunk of the car in anguish over the assassination. I think we're going to stop there. That just feels right for today. I hope you'll come back next time to continue hearing about how they treat the president. I don't know if we'll get to hear about anything that happened with Governor Connolly. I'm not sure if he had a particular say-so about that, but if he even has insights to that, we'll hear that. And then we will continue on to hear his account of treating Lee Oswald as well. So please come back for that. Let me know in the comments. Again, I'd love to hear where you were on that day. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about kind of the macabre humor, even like what we heard from Dr. Baxter in that situation of having joked about the very thing that they ended up having happen. I think the other thing that stands out to me just there from the end is the behavior of Clint Hill. I don't know that I had heard it described from that angle before. Is that something that you've heard before, that he kind of lost it? I mean, you can see why. You could see totally why he would have a breakdown at that moment, and that all of the panic of not being able to protect back there would make him heightened in his intensity now. I'm sure he's still operating fully out of just shock. Well, let me know what you noticed in the comments, and I hope to see you back next time. Come back for more of Dr. Crenshaw. Have a great day. Bye.